All right, Michelle, warm up. We're supposed to do an OG Rose conversation. All right, let's go. Dun, 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 dun. All right. Hello.
I'm in like the corner of the ring.
Yeah, you're getting
It's
Eye of
like
the
getting
Tiger.
like a massage.
They played that
like,
at every wrestling match.
Yeah, getting like
Eye
a squirt of
the
water
Tiger.
in my
Yeah,
mouth,
it's
and
all right,
got my
we're
coach pumping
gonna
me
talk
up.
about philosophy, and the kids are asleep, and it's late. All right. Well, hi everyone. We're pumped now.
We're pumped up. We're ready.
We did our exercises. We're
knock it
warmed
out.
up. Yeah.
Knock each other out? Are we going to punch each other?
No, we're going to talk about thoughtlessness. But maybe that'll work, because if you knock me out, I'll be thoughtless. So yeah, maybe that's actually what we want to do. The
Promise
paper.
I won't punch you.
No, I will. Thank you.
So we're going to be talking about in honor of thoughtlessness. See?
Yes, thoughtless. See, we tripped over the word because we want the meaning to match the meaning.
I wanted to show you that I'm thoughtless.
And I was like, we had this kind of a random beginning to show that we don't think about how we do our intros. So, it's all...
beginning I've ever heard.
Oh my gosh, Eye of the Tiger? Nobody likes that. So it's in honor of thoughtlessness is the name of the piece.
Yeah.
And the general idea is that a lot of times people who, we talk about people who are principled, who have conviction, who stand by what they believe. And there's a sense in which because they don't think about what they believe, they just believe it. It's like honorable. There's something mighty and good about it. And they'll make examples of Joan of Arc or Thomas More, these different people who died for their beliefs. And so then we have this idea that, principles are good, convictions are good, et cetera, et cetera. And why in the world would you be thinking about these things unless you didn't really believe them? And so there can be this skepticism for thought and honor in name of principles. And there's some truth to it. But as we try to kind of flesh out, there's also some dangers to it.
There's something that is almost revered about
thoughtlessness.
Because and the big reason why is because, well, first of all, like the distinction you make in the paper about thoughtlessness is not stupidity.
Right.
It's not. It's just not necessarily taking the time to grapple through questions on a particular subject.
Right.
And the reason why there can be why there could be the revering, right, of the thoughtlessness is actually because, like you said, it's about belief.
Yes.
It's like your faith. There's something really powerful about faith. But when it's not, there's something also about the grappling that makes that faith substantiated,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Jewish traditions, rabbi, there's a constant debate, there's a constant discussion. And as the paper's going to go on, there's a difference between a cheap thoughtlessness and a costly thoughtlessness. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, because autonomous rationality is impossible, you do indeed have to rest your rationality in thinking upon something that is irrational or unrational or something,
which is a great category.
Or axioms. Axioms. There are some axioms you can't. At the end of the day, you will have to rest your thinking upon premises that cannot be entirely translated into rational terms. The problem is that we can want to skip the work and just go straight to ascribing to something thoughtlessly, and that's where you can get what David Hume called bad philosophy as opposed to good philosophy.
Right.
And then there's all the social revering of doing that, of sticking to your principles, sticking to your guns. And in America, it's a practical people. This is the birth of the philosophy of pragmatism. William James, the new pragmatism of Richard Rorty, where America has always prided itself as being a practical nation and even having a certain skepticism toward intellectualism. And frankly, for good reason. Very often intellectuals who just live in an ivory tower, just like David Hume talked about, think they know how people should live their lives, and often they don't have a clue. Right. And then you have the central planning that Friedrich Hayek warned tended to be very efficient, but people think they're so smart so they can do so much. So certainly there's good reason for there to be a skepticism of the intellectual life, because it doesn't always have a great track record. But on the flip side, when you have this cheap thoughtlessness, you run the risk of Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. You run the risk of tribalism. You run the risk of living thoughtlessly, which has a lot of unintended consequences.
Right. Well, this is why, it's interesting you saying all of that because, maybe there would have been, like where Hume is very aware of this ivory tower kind of problem. Right. At least there's kind of an awareness that actually the more you might study, it might take you further away, right? From the common life aspects of the practical knowledge, right? That you would need to understand your community, your daily tasks, your things you're involved in. But I fear today we don't have that. It's almost like we've lost sight of that a little bit. And we assume, right, that someone who has and there is education in school and in college and universities, etc. However, it can be, it's just an assumption. It's an assumption that if you've done these things, or if you've gone to these places, that you are truly have done the work, the rigorous work,
right,
of questioning things, of thinking.
Right.
And honestly, you probably have done quite a bit with those institutions. However, because they tend to be much more career driven, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Sure.
But really, it's career driven. So it's going to kind of set you on specific paths, which give you more like of a niche knowledge, right? It's niche knowledge.
Sure.
And so I think we still kind of have this assumption that like you're studied, you're well-rounded, you're like the Renaissance man.
So that's interesting.
Yeah,
so you're suggesting that even our mechanisms where we think we become thoughtful and then maybe ultimately return to it, those mechanisms themselves are broke.
100%.
Well, that's interesting. But I think that's true, because then the people who just ascribe directly to cheap thoughtlessness really feel justified, because they're like, look, you guys go off to college and come back and you're not even that smart.
Exactly.
You don't really know that much, which then just worsens the problem, because the people who skipped the thinking life go, look, the thinking life doesn't do anything for you, so then they become more sure that cheap thoughtlessness is justified. And the paper's also going to talk about how we have these figures, these sort of heroes, Thomas More, Martin Luther King, Bonhoeffer, these people who died for what they believe. So if you have these images then that you interpret a certain way, then you think that, oh yeah, not only do the kids come back from college and they're not very smart, but two, the great people of history were men of conviction, so I'm going to just be a person of conviction and not worry about reading the books. Now, of course, the paper's going to point out that paradoxically, very often these people like Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King, these are incredible scholars. They, in fact, were not thoughtless, cheap thoughtless. They were men of conviction, but after great thought. I'm hitting the table now. I'm making bam. I'm pounding a point. I need a gavel. These were people of great thought, of whom became men of conviction and principle, women of conviction, after the philosophical journey. So these are who David Hume would call good philosophers. So you have you have people who are cheaply thoughtless. Sure. Then you have bad philosophers. And then you have good philosophers, which would also be the category of people who are costly thoughtlessness. They paid a price to ultimately rest on an axiom or a principle and to die for that thing. Right. So, it's very important. The great irony here is very often the men and women of principle that decorate our history, or we look back upon and want to be like, we interpret as cheaply thoughtless, when in fact they were costly thoughtless. Exactly. And so they fit into our mechanism of confirmation bias if we don't want to go on the philosophical journey. And then to your point, Michelle, if in fact the people that seem to be going on the philosophical journey by going to college don't even come back seeming that very philosophical, or at least intellectual in a positive way, well then people feel really sure about just sticking to cheap thoughtlessness.
Yeah, no, 100%. And the thing is, I bring up all of the institutional stuff, not it's, the person who goes to college, it's kind of interesting because it's not enough. You just don't know. I think that's the main thing. You don't know. The person may be extraordinarily philosophically robust, having gone through...
It's just not a necessary relationship.
Yeah, another person may not have. Yes. And that just may be given, maybe they had a particular track of a career that just did not really include those studies very much. So it's just... But I think it would be kind of interesting to see, like, where does the risk fall more so on like the cheap
Is it better to be thoughtless?
If you had to choose, I mean, obviously the best would be the good philosophy of Hume, right?
But between bad philosopher and cheap thoughtlessness. Yeah, that's a great quote. David Hume. Yeah. I mean, David Hume kind of warned that if you don't leave a common life and go on the philosophical journey, then you're susceptible to manipulation. You're susceptible to your common life falling apart and you not having the mental tools to recognize it. You're susceptible to bigotry, all these different things. The banal, which ultimately the book Belonging again will put under the category of the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talked about, that we've talked about before, which is just when evil becomes everyday, something thoughtless, something routine, and you don't have the mental tools to realize it's occurring.
Yes.
But then you have the bad philosopher, which is the person who goes on the philosophical journey but stops halfway. They live in the ivory tower, and then they compare the world with their Platonic ideas of it and try to remake it in light of those ideas, of which the world can never be, of course, because the world is imperfect. So then it just unleashes violence upon the world, and that's discussed in Deconstructing Common Life. Which of those two is better? It's hard to say. It probably has a lot to do with the size of the state, the government, the political body. Either way, you're in trouble because you're either going to have the people who are thoughtless, who are cheaply thoughtless, or that are unphilosophical. Let's just say unphilosophical. The unphilosophical person that will probably seize government to stop all of the perceived threat of the intellectual, so there will be a violence unleashed if the state is big. Or you'll have the intellectual class, the bad intellectual class, claim the state to stop the unphilosophical. So you're probably just going to end up with violence either way, some reign of terror either way. Unfortunately. Sorry. Not too good. So there's a call, but this would just mean that, like, the philosophical journey is not optional.
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck, right? The philosophical journey going the whole way is not optional. Everyone needs to do it. The whole society needs to do it. And if we have these misinterpretations of these people of principle of history as being cheaply thoughtless, as opposed to engaging in costly thoughtlessness and earned axioms, then that's only going to worsen our problem.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think the thing is, you got this cheap thoughtlessness, and that's just no work being done there for in terms of the mental rigor of that. Yes. This isn't talking about like having a high IQ though. It's literally just asking questions. I think there's a curiosity can be a huge amplifier of that costly thoughtlessness, right? And we're saying that because eventually you're going to have to there's going to be something that looks kind of thoughtless about what you're doing because there's a conviction, and it's kind of this unrational, this almost without utterance. You couldn't really have some sort of expression by which
it's not rational, irrational, it's unrational.
Exactly.
But there's the unrational earned through rationality, and there's the unrational that is not earned through rationality, and therefore is ultimately irrational, or cannot be meaningfully saved from irrationality.
Well, see, costly, that word came out when you were speaking, it stood out to me, and I think that's why, just to bring it back to the institutions really quick, because those things are actually costly. We kind of like money.
Interesting.
They cost a lot. I think we've almost equated that because it is costly.
Therefore, your point. That's good.
It is. Because it's just a lot of money to you pay for it, so you assume that it does have.
Since it costs a lot, it must be costly.
It must have that value to that dollar amount, and
that would speak
whether it does or doesn't, you'd have to be looked into a little bit more.
The guy who does a class at Harvard, Michael Sinclair, did the book on what money can't buy. And he just talks about how market and money valuations has become our only valuation. So that would make sense, right? Like if it costs a lot, it must be costly thoughtless. It must be costly. It must be an earned life of the mind because it costs so much. That's a good association.
Yeah, I mean, just came to mind.
Oh yeah, no, because we let our monetary values do our thinking for us.
And I mean, it's like sometimes it could be the case that it's
could be,
but it might not be. You just can't make the assumption, right?
No.
I mean, I think going back to this idea of like belief, I just think that was very, very interesting in the paper. Something I'd mentioned to you was just this idea that, it's wild how the person's going to look the same. Honestly, the person who has conviction and has done the rigorous work to get to that conviction can often look just exactly the same as the person who has conviction, who just felt really strongly about something, who did no work, read nothing, didn't look into any other sides of it. They can look just the same. And
absolutely.
I mean, what do you think is the thing that really reveals the robustness of one versus the other?
This is critical. I mean, you want to be childlike, but you don't want to be childish. You want to be someone who's principled, but not cheap principled. One of the great difficulties of life is often the optimal states of whatever is a mirror image of the negative state of that same thing. This is quite difficult. The paper makes that example where it talks about, I think Karl Barth was who discussed it, is when the devil shows up to tempt Jesus in the wilderness, the devil's just like telling Jesus, hey man, go sit on the throne, okay? He's tempting Jesus to ultimately take his place as
Rightful
on the
place,
his rightful
yeah,
place. He's
right.
just tempting him to do it not through the cross. He's just to skip the cross is basically what the temptation is. And
Right.
Jesus is like, no, I have to go through the cross. Well, but a Jesus who's sitting on the throne though would look identical. Both Jesuses, one who went through the cross and the one who did not, would look identical on the throne. But there's some secret there about how the how changes the end. They're the same and yet they're not the same. How the ruling occurs, how the rulership occurs is radically different. Now, of course, theologians will say, if Jesus doesn't go through the cross, then we can't be in his presence as he rules, so we would not be able to be part of his ruleship, and one of the reasons he goes through the cross is so that the rest of humanity can join him in his kingdom. And there is something to that, right? Like if you engage in cheap thoughtlessness, you're inevitably just going to be in the tribe of people who think like you. You're not going to have epistemic humility. There's going to be a certain level of, you're not going to invite people in because because if you invite difference in, they're going to make you think. Almost by definition, and therefore move your cheap thinking to costly thinking. So one of the signs, is, are they exclusive as opposed to inclusive? Are they humble, before difference? Are they confident? Are they nervous? Are they existentially unraveled by difference? So, the community that people surround themselves with. So, you got two people, both men or women of principle, but what kind of people they surround themselves with? Are they surrounded by people that only think like them? Or are they surrounded by real difference? Are they humble? Are they, what kind of conversations do they have? How do they talk? What do they talk about? What's on the bookshelf? There would be signs, but you would have to pay attention. But of course, here's the irony.
Yes.
Who's the kinds of people that would probably pay attention? The people who have done the costly work. They would have the ability to recognize the person who has not done the work from the person who has done the work.
Yes.
But how would that person who's able to so recognize be able to convince the other people that this is a person who hasn't done the work as opposed to do the work? And there's a problem almost in using the Christian language a little more of total depravity, fall, if you don't look for Jesus, you don't even know you need to look for Jesus. And there can be a sort of depravity here that is very difficult to overcome. But I do think there are ways you can tell, but you have to really have your eyes open.
Well, it does. I think too that with all that you just said, it also shows how there's also a sort of, when I was reading through, there's a sense in which, wow, because I can't know, I really can't make that judgment about another person. I mean, it's tempting.
Sure.
Or you might, maybe the default can be, I don't know, literally, either way, for good or for bad. Whether this person is the good philosophy or the bad philosophy, I really don't know. Really it just kind of puts the emphasis back on, like, what are you doing? What am I doing? So it's kind of like, okay, I really don't know. So why don't I just not focus on, so much about judging one way or the other.
But a classic sign of someone who's gone on the philosophical journey is they're not too sure of themselves.
Yeah.
And there's a spirit of freedom around them as a result, to allude to Leopold Hand, who made that quote where he said the spirit of freedom is found in that soul that's not too sure of itself. So that's another sign. If you've got two people of principle, but one of them is just, no doubt, and they're fundamentalist to a dangerous, in a problematic way, as opposed to someone else who's like, well, hold on, let me listen. Maybe they're always the person who's gone on the journey holds their principles, their unrational premises with an open hand, where the one who's done it cheaply holds it with a clutch hand.
Yes. That bird analogy,
yes,
right?
That's right.
But I it's funny because as you're talking about that too, and something I thought about earlier is that, see that there's this, like you're saying, there's this huge, almost very, very devastating thing that occurs in studying these figures, right? These, MLK Jr., all of these Bonhoeffer, all these figures, because we never knew them as real people in our own lives.
Yes.
And it's wonderful that we have their example and we can know about them and for the change they've brought. The challenge is that now they are stagnant. They are now in their very superficial form.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Two-dimensional.
In a very two-dimensional form. So it's almost like by the nature of our encounter with them in this two-dimensional form, it can only be thought of as just pure conviction, right?
Sure.
We don't have the depth of their
we only have the end point.
And this just might be in general, just I don't know, a challenge with I mean, social media obviously is a big, it exacerbates this problem a lot because you've got all these sort of facades of different people you can never really know.
Right.
And so really it's just going to be about like what fruits are born from what they, what they
Well, you'd have to read their biographies.
Right, but yeah, I mean, that would help, reading their biographies, reading autobiographies, reading...
But why are you reading their biographies? Why don't you just believe? There are mechanisms to keep you from discovering the depths of those thinkers, and so you just encounter them on posters. You just encounter what people say about them. There's they are not here to correct our impressions of them. Oh, your ice cream's melting everywhere. Oh, I am so sorry, but you're going to be a person of character and not panic over the ice cream melting. It's
Flash this scene is just like me, like SpongeBob, just screaming, like running around in circles.
The ice cream, lick it quick, lick it quick.
I know, right? I didn't want to make loud crunching sounds during the talk, so I sacrificed the ice cream
for the banana.
The banana was quieter.
But you can put the banana in the ice cream.
I'm still gonna eat this.
Yeah,
I mean, this puddle of magic.
You just look it up. It's fine. It's fine. But no, I mean, to what you're saying, these people are faces on an. It kind of sometimes does make you think where the Bible warns against images, idols.
Exactly.
Because they're flat, because you see them, because they're afraid that you can start thinking of a god as something like a statue, as opposed to you can't make any images because if you can't make images, then you have to treat everything as alive.
Exactly, and this is the thing. There's no heartbeat anymore. There's the heartbeat that carries on through the generations, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Right. And we see that in oral tradition. That's why I think oral tradition maybe would have been less susceptible to this because...
Oh, it was less susceptible. You can go through the Gutenberg galaxy and Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, oral tradition. Olgan, he's really good on that. I mean, that was one of the reasons they were hesitant to move away from it because there was something about it's interesting. I guess what was it? The Invention of News, that book where it talked about today we don't trust things if someone tells it to us. But it used to be that they didn't trust it if it was written down.
Interesting.
Because they were like, dude, I don't even see the person who's telling me this. How can I know their character? How can I judge what they're thinking? So today's the exact opposite, because we think we get more objectivity when it's written down, but in the past they thought you got way less. You couldn't make a good judgment of the info because you didn't have the context of the person speaking in front of you. So they did. They certainly there was a sense that that oral tradition had a better chance of being alive and better judged as well. And we've lost that. Yeah. And in losing that, we just have the images of these figures, so they fit very nicely into whatever ideology we want Bonhoeffer to fit. It's like, Bonhoeffer's a great example. I mean, you got people on the left claiming, you got people on the right claiming him. He just fits into whatever you want him to fit him on.
Because he's got cool glasses. So.
Yeah, he's got cool glasses. He looks neat, and as long as you don't read his biography, he fits great. So you just fit him great. And again, and really too, the brain wants to avoid work. The brain loves avoiding work. So any interpretation or any system of thought that will keep it from having to do work, it's going to give in to. So if you honor thoughtlessness, if you create routes of which you can engage in cheap thoughtlessness, cheap thinking, and then get social approval for doing that's the other thing. Like, oh, you're a man of principle and conviction. You almost get praise for not thinking about all this stuff. Then that's what your brain's going to do, and that's what you're going to do. And I think we see this happening on the right and the left every day of the week. And because I mean, think about it. What can the philosopher do other than threaten you? I mean, they're like reading everything. Like there's almost an inherent sense in which what I mean by all the philosopher do can threaten you. Like you have your views, and the philosopher's coming along, and what can they do other than perhaps risk your views? Like you'd have to either change them. Let's put it this way: the philosopher comes along and presents an argument that makes you keep your view. Well, then you might as well not have met the philosopher, right? There's like no value add. But so the only thing the philosopher can do is come along and be a threat. Unless that is, you're in the business of truth. But if you don't believe in truth, if you only believe in, say, your tribe or your identity or winning, then the philosopher must necessarily only have a negative role. The philosopher or theologian or anyone who's engaged in abstract thinking can only have a positive role in your society if the society believes in truth or believes in higher ideals or ultimately believes truth or whatever is the case should have the last say. Now, is that easy to determine? How do you determine? There's a million more questions that come from that. But really, if generally speaking, people don't believe in truth, or they believe it's too difficult to get to, or it's too covered up by relativism or historical conditioning or different things, well, then gradually and slowly, the person who engages in costly thoughtlessness, costly thinking, that engages in the philosopher's journey that Hume's described, they ultimately can only be a threat, and so they will fade away. Like your ice cream.
Be rekindled, thinking man.
Be rekindled. So that's just an example where your overall society's view of the role and possibility of truth is extremely consequential.
Yeah, 100%. Well, it's funny because you said the philosopher, right? He can be a threat with his abstract thinking, but isn't it funny because when we do these iconic flat 2D, interpretations of whoever we want to say, these inspirational figures over the years, isn't that an abstraction?
Oh yeah, sure.
It's like
absolutely.
we still have a propensity towards abstraction, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
The
The
philosopher, one way or the other.
The philosopher ironically realizes that you have to take abstraction straight on to get to the real world
and embrace it. Realize that you are abstracting.
No, the joke is that people who hate abstraction end up incredibly abstract.
Exactly, almost more abstract.
More abstract, more two-dimensional. Where the philosopher person takes on abstraction in order to get at the real. Exactly, what else is the philosopher doing? What else is the philosopher doing other than trying to get at the real? What else are they trying to do? And there's just a recognition that the real is really, really, really hard to get at, even though it seems so simple and so easy to get at, because you have to get through so many layers of abstraction. And of course, the other great irony is, the philosopher is seen as a threat, and they're therefore kicked out, while simultaneously people are making, talking about the value of being a person of conviction, to stand alone, and to upset the crowd, and to stand against, to stand alone, to stand against what everyone else thinks. So it's this very, strange mechanism of your casting out people that really would make you think about your views, while simultaneously positioning yourself as one of those heroic people that believes in something that other people don't believe. Where there's this irony that is occurring there. And on that note, we should let you eat your ice cream and the banana, and it's midnight. It's a good time for ice cream.
Yeah, it's always a good time for ice cream. I'm telling you. I was going to share a really deep, profound philosophical insight the other day.
Oh, yeah.
So I made chocolate chip cookies. And then the next morning I ate them for breakfast. And I was happy. So basically that
was the philosophical journey. You ended on chocolate chip cookies, and you embedded yourself in a common life of breakfast. But anyway, this has been OG Rose. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time, friends.
We always appreciate it. For more, please visit Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, website. All likes, subscriptions, and so forth is appreciated, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.